Now, to customize the email that we send out to users to verify the account, we need to override one of the methods in the notification class that Laravel uses to send out this email. And to do that, we can go to our providers, auth service provider, and we call a method from the verify email notification, which is the notification that Laravel uses, to override the URL that we're actually sending with that notification. So if we go to verify email, there's a method called create URL using. Let's click on that. And this is a basic notification class. Everything here will be left as is. You see that we do have the text here, verify email, the line, please click on the button below, which is exactly what we saw in the email that was sent to the user. And we have a method here that generates a verification URL. Now, this method looks for a create URL using callback, which is a callback function in this class. And if it exists, then it would use that to generate a URL. If it doesn't exist, then it will just generate a URL based on the current application endpoint, which is our API, which is what we don't want. So we have to override the method for generating the URL here by implementing or by defining our custom create URL using function in the auth service provider. So this function takes as arguments the user, and that is the notifiable user. So the user who is being notified, and it should in here return the URL string that we want to use to generate our endpoint for the front end. So let's quickly do this by creating a new configuration variable in app config. And here by default, we have a URL endpoint that points to the backend URL, but you also want another endpoint or another parameter for the client URL that will specify the URL of the Nuxt application. So here I'm just going to call it client URL. And let's go to .env and specify what that should be. So over .env, I'm going to say client URL equals http skillmeter.test, and this is going to run on port 3000. So this is the URL on which our Nuxt application will be running in the end. And it is very important that it is the same domain as your app URL, because we will be using cookies from the back end, store them in the front end, and send them back for authentication. So if you use a different URL than your API, the cookies will not be read because you can't share cookies across different domains. Now, when we implement the app in production, the API will run on something like api.skillmeter.com, and the front end will run on skillmeter.com. So they will all be on the same top level domain, meaning that they can actually share the same cookies. But for development, we'll just run them on this domain and simply run the Nuxt application on port 3000. So over here in the auth service provider, let's quickly start by grabbing the front end URL, which will simply be config app.client URL, which is what we just added. And in the Nuxt side, we are going to create an endpoint called email/verify. So this is the link we want users to be sent to when they try to verify their email. So when they click on the link in their email account for verification, this is where we want to send them to in the front end. Now, let's also grab the base URL, which is the app URL. So config app.url. Now let's generate the verify email or verify URL. And we are going to use Laravel's URL class here and generate a temporary signed URL. Okay, so a temporary signed route is simply a route in Laravel that has a timestamp, meaning that it does expire. So we have to define how long we want that link to be valid. And in this case, we'll simply say we want it to be valid for 60 minutes. And if the user doesn't verify their account within 60 minutes, then we will invalidate that email and they would have to request a different link later on. So here, this function will need to take the name of the route that we want to use to generate the endpoint. In this case, we defined it as verification.verify. So we basically copy that in there. And we provide it with how long we want this route to be valid. So the duration for the route. So let's use Carbon and we'll just say now and add 60 minutes to it. So add minutes and we'll just say 60. So this route will be valid for 60 minutes. And then we can pass in any parameters that have to go with the route. Here we did indicate that we need an ID, but in this case, of course, I want to be more explicit and I'll say we need a user actually. So let me change that from ID to user. And we need to pass that user as the route parameter. So the user is going to simply be the user that we are getting into this function that gets passed in by Laravel. And we need to get the hash ID. Because remember that we did change our model so that we're actually using the hash ID for root key model binding and not the ID. So by passing that hash ID, we can directly pull in the user object here without writing a manual query. Then we also need to pass the hash, and this hash is basically going to be a hash of the email that the user is using to authenticate. So whatever the email is for notification, we're going to hash that and send it with the link. So here under the user model, we have access to a method called get email for verification. And where does this come from? Well, this comes from the authentication trait or the must verify user contract that we already implement in the user model. So we do have a method called get email for verification. So that will simply pull out whatever email address we are using to verify the user here. So we are going to use that to get the user's information. We are passing it to this route. It's going to be a temporary signed route that will expire in 60 minutes. And we are passing it the user object, which is a route parameter, and the hash, which is just a hash of the user's email. What we receive from this function is a URL that looks something like this. So http skillmeter.test / whatever we defined here for verification. Okay, so it will be something like this: API auth and what we defined in there, the user's email and the user object, the ID. So this is exactly the link that we received from the front end before. And we said we want to change this because we want to redirect the user to the Nuxt application instead and not to the API directly. And the Nuxt application will be responsible for sending the request to the backend. So the way we want the Nuxt application to end up is we want to have a link that contains the Nuxt base URL. So skillmeter.test / port 3000, which is the client-side URL, and / email verify, which is the endpoint that we are going to create in Nuxt later on. And we want to get a verify URL as a route parameter or a query parameter. And this will contain all of this information. So it will contain the verification URL that we need to send back to the API. And the reason we are going to strip out this part is because the front end, we are going to configure our fetch API in Nuxt to already have the base URL and the API. So we don't need all of this as part of the verify URL again in the front end. All we need is the endpoint that we'll be sending the request to in the back end. So to do this, we have to take this URL that is generated from the verify URL and replace all of this portion with nothing. So we are going to strip that out and only use this part. And we are going to append that to the front end URL. So we simply do a return of front end URL concatenated with a query parameter that we will call verify URL, and that will be equal to URL encode. So all the special characters will be converted to URL encoding. So let's do that, and we said we basically want to take this and replace all of this API part with nothing and strip that out. So to do that, we can use Laravel's string helper function and string of. This takes the URL or the string that we want to replace information from, in this case the verify URL, and we call the replace. And in the replace function, we need to pass what we want to replace, the text that we want to replace. So we want to replace all of this base URL /API. So we want to replace all of that with nothing. Again, in this case, we are taking all of this and we are stripping that part off and only retaining this. And then we are doing that through a URL encoding, which basically encodes all special characters with a URL encoded character. So let's put in all the classes that we are importing, or let's import all the classes that we're using here. So import the string, which is Illuminate support string. We should have the carbon imported and the URL class imported. So we have everything working here. And if this is working the way we expect it to, we should be able to come here. Let's do a migrate fresh again and go back to Postman and try to register the user again. So let's do a register here, click. We have the user record created. It's coming back exactly the same way. But if we look at the email that was sent to the user, it should now contain a URL that has, or that is pointing to the client side, okay? So if I just zoom in here a little bit, you can see that this URL is now pointing to a port 3000, which is the port where our Nuxt application will be running. And it's going to go to the email verify endpoint in the front end. And it has the verify URL, which is basically this part here. So when we make a request from Nuxt, we will be sending the request to this endpoint here. So this is working pretty nicely. And in the next lesson, we are going to see how we can actually use this information to verify the user. Because right now, we don't have any functionality to actually resend the verification email or verify the user. So we are going to be using that to verify the user in the next lesson.